Midnight in Blackwood isn't silent. It's heavy. It's a thick, suffocating blanket of damp fog and the smell of rusted iron. My name is Elias, and I live in the spaces people forget. My workshop is a basement sanctuary, cluttered with the skeletal remains of mid-century televisions and the copper guts of antique clocks. I like things that are broken. They don't ask questions. They don't leave. It was 3 nights ago when I found it. It was buried under a stack of moth-eaten wool blankets at the Miller estate sale, a house that felt like it was mourning its own existence. The radio was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was encased in dark, polished mahogany, but the faceplate wasn't sandered. There were no station numbers, no FM or AM markings. Just a single glowing vacuum tube behind a glass window and a heavy brass dial that felt cold enough to burn. It whispered to me before I even plugged it in. Back in my workshop, the rain lashed against the high, narrow windows, creating a rhythmic drumming that synced with my heartbeat. I spent hours cleaning the corrosion. My fingers were stained with grease and old solder. I replaced a blown capacitor, my hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from an inexplicable static charge that seemed to radiate from the mahogany casing. When I finally flipped the toggle switch, the room didn't just fill with sound, it filled with a presence. The vacuum tube began to glow, not with the warm orange of a standard radio, but with a piercing, ethereal violet. A low-frequency hum vibrated through the floorboards, rattling my jars of screws. I turned the brass dial. Static. Shrill, piercing static that sounded like 1,000 dead voices trying to scream through a keyhole. I almost turned it off. My hand was on the switch when the noise snapped into a terrifying, crystalline clarity. A voice came through. It wasn't a DJ. It wasn't a podcast. It was a news anchor. Dry, professional, and chillingly familiar. The date is October 14th, the voice said. The time is 11:15 p.m. My breath hitched. I looked at the digital clock on my workbench. It was October 13th, 11:15 p.m. Exactly 24 hours off. I thought it was a prank. A recorded broadcast from a previous year, perhaps. But then the voice continued. Tragedy struck the downtown district tonight as the historic Blackwood bell tower collapsed during the height of the storm, claiming the lives of 3 people seeking shelter. The bell tower. I could see it from my window. It was standing perfectly still, silhouetted against the lightning. I sat there for an hour, the violet light reflecting in my eyes, listening to weather reports for a day that hadn't happened yet. I heard about a stock market dip that would occur tomorrow afternoon. I heard about a hit and run on 5th Street that was still 20 hours away.
Then, the broadcast shifted. The professional tone of the anchor faltered, replaced by a momentary burst of white noise. When the voice returned, it was deeper, more intimate. It felt like the speaker had leaned closer to the microphone, speaking directly into my marrow. And in local news, the voice murmured, "The investigation continues into the unexplained disappearance of Elias Thorne." My heart stopped. The solder iron fell from my hand, searing a black mark into the wood of the bench. Thorne, a local recluse, was last seen in his basement workshop. Authorities found his equipment still running, but the room was empty, save for a lingering scent of ozone and a single, unexplained violet stain on the floor. I wasn't just hearing the future. I was hearing my own obituary. The radio began to whine, a high-pitched frequency that made my teeth ache. The violet glow intensified, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls that seemed to move independently of the light. I reached for the dial to shut it off, but my hand froze. The voice wasn't finished. Neighbors reported hearing a frantic pounding on the basement door exactly 24 hours prior to the discovery. And then, as if on cue, the sound erupted. From the top of the stairs, 3 heavy, rhythmic thuds echoed through the house. Thud, thud, thud. Someone was at the door, and according to the radio, they were already a day too late. I looked at the radio. The violet light was pulsing like a heartbeat. The broadcast didn't end, it just started to play a recording of what sounded like me screaming. I looked toward the stairs, the shadows stretching toward me like grasping fingers. The pounding started again, louder this time, and a voice from the other side of the door, a voice that sounded exactly like my own, whispered, "Elias, let us in. The frequency is almost set."
The voice on the other side of the door did not just sound like me. It had the exact cadence of my own breath, that slight nervous hitch I get when my heart is hammering against my ribs. My hand trembled as I gripped the cold brass knob. "Who is there?" I asked, though a part of me already knew the answer. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise I had ever heard. It was not just an absence of sound. It was an absence of reality itself. I twisted the lock and pulled the door open. The hallway was empty. The dim yellow light of the apartment corridor flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to crawl away from my feet. No one was there. No footprints, no draft, nothing but the smell of old dust and ozone. I looked down. On the welcome mat lay a single small brass gear from a clock, still spinning as if it had been dropped by someone in a great hurry. I retreated into my workshop, slamming the door and bolting it shut. My breath came in ragged gasps. The radio, the vintage Zenith I had found, was glowing now, not with the warm amber of vacuum tubes, but with a sharp, piercing violet light that did not seem to belong in this world. The static cleared, replaced not by the voice of a news anchor, but by a series of coordinates and a time. 8:42 a.m., the intersection of Miller and Grant, a minor collision, a bicycle and a delivery truck, no fatalities, but a life altered by a permanent limp. The voice was different now. It was layered, as if 1,000 people were saying the same words at once, their voices stacking into a mounting of sound. I looked at the clock. It was 8:15 a.m. The intersection was only 6 blocks away. I did not think. I did not weigh the consequences of playing God or interfering with the threads of fate. I just grabbed my jacket and ran. The air outside felt thin, like a veil that had been stretched too tight. As I reached Miller and Grant, the world felt like a high-definition photograph, too sharp, too vivid. I saw him, a young boy on a red bicycle, wobbling slightly as he approached the corner. And there, coming down Grant Street, was the silver delivery truck, its driver looking down at a clipboard, oblivious. They were on a collision course, a minor event in the grand scheme of the universe, but a tragedy for that boy. At exactly 8:41 and 50 seconds, I stepped into the street. I did not scream. I did not wave my arms. I simply walked into the path of the boy, forcing him to swerve and brake hard. He fell, scraping his knee on the asphalt, crying out in surprise and pain. The truck roared past a second later, missing him by a dozen feet. I had done it. I had changed the future. The radio's prophecy was broken. But as the boy stood up, brushing the grid from his palms, the world stopped. Not figuratively. Literally.
Mid-stride, frozen in the air. A pigeon, wings outstretched, suspended above a mailbox like a statue. The sound of the city died instantly, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that felt like a needle through my eardrums. That is when I saw them. They were standing in the middle of the frozen traffic. 3 of them. Tall, impossibly thin figures, shrouded in what looked like liquid smoke or vibrating static. They did not have faces, just smooth, matte surfaces where features should be. They did not walk, they glided, their forms vibrating at a frequency that made the very air around them blur and pixelate. The shadow observers. One of them turned its head toward me. I did not see eyes, but I felt a gaze that was colder than the vacuum of space. It reached out a long, tapering finger, and the air around me began to ripple like water. "You were not supposed to be here," a voice whispered, not into my ears, but directly into my nervous system. "The weave has been torn." Suddenly, the sound of the world rushed back in. The woman finished her step. The pigeon flapped away. The boy on the bike looked at me with confusion, then pedaled off. But the figures were gone, or so I thought. I walked back to my apartment, my legs feeling like lead weights. Every shadow I passed seemed to linger a second too long. Every reflection in the shop windows felt like it was moving just a fraction of a second behind my own movements. When I finally reached my workshop, the radio was screaming. Not news, not coordinates. It was a recording of my own voice from 30 seconds ago, screaming in agony. I walked over to the workbench to switch it off, but my hand stopped midair. There, on the workbench, was a photograph I had not taken. It was a photo of me, standing in this very workshop, taken from the corner of the ceiling. In the photo, I am looking at the radio, but behind me, standing in the shadows of the corner, is me, another version of me, his hands reaching for my throat. I looked up at the corner of the room, the exact spot where the photo would have been taken. There was nothing there, but a small black lens embedded in the drywall, and it was blinking a rhythmic red. Then, the radio spoke one last time before the tubes blew out in a shower of sparks. "Elias, look behind the mirror." I turned to the small glass mirror over my sink. My reflection was not moving. It was standing perfectly still, watching me with a predatory grin that did not belong on my face. And then, the reflection reached out and tapped on the glass from the inside. Knock. Knock. Knock.
The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was 1,000 times heavier. My reflection didn't move. It stood there, hand pressed firmly against the inside of the glass, while I was already halfway across the room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It didn't have my eyes anymore. They were voids, dark pools that seemed to swallow the dim light of the hallway. I realized then that I wasn't looking at a mirror. I was looking at a window into a place that shouldn't exist. The radio on the nightstand hissed to life, the static sounding like 1,000 dry leaves skittering across pavement. Observation logged. A voice rasped. It wasn't the announcer. It was a chorus of whispers, overlapping and jagged. Timeline deviation detected. Correction required in 10 minutes. Location: 4th and Miller. The girl with the red balloon. My blood turned to ice. Clara, the neighbor's daughter. She was always at that corner at 4 p.m., waiting for the school bus. I looked at the clock. 3:51. I didn't think about the monster in the mirror. I didn't think about the silver light I'd seen pulsing in the sky. I grabbed my jacket and bolted out the door. The world outside was wrong. As I sprinted toward the corner, the air felt thick, like I was running through waist-deep water. Colors were bleeding out of the buildings. A car passed me, but its engine sound was delayed, catching up to the physical vehicle 3 seconds late. Reality was fraying at the seams, and I was the one pulling the thread. I saw her, Clara. She was standing on the curb, her small hand clutching the string of a bright red balloon. Above her, a massive rusted crane on a construction site.
was groaning. I saw the cable snap. It didn't happen fast. It happened in frames, like a broken film strip. The heavy iron hook began its descent, drifting through the air with a lethargic, predatory grace. I screamed her name, but the sound died in the heavy air. I lunged. My boots hit the pavement, and for a split second, everything froze. The shadow observers were there, standing in the middle of the street, their vibrating forms humming so loud my ears began to bleed. They didn't stop me. They just watched. I tackled Clara, rolling us both onto hard asphalt, just as the iron hook smashed into the spot where she had been standing. The impact didn't make a sound. Instead, a wave of white distortion rippled outward from the crash site. When the dust settled, the girl was crying, but she was alive. I tried to stand, but a searing white-hot agony erupted in my right arm. I looked down and gasped. My skin was translucent. Beneath the surface, my veins weren't red anymore. They were glowing with a pulsating violet light, and my bones looked like they were made of flickering static. I was being overridden. I was becoming a glitch in my own life.
I stumbled back to my apartment, shielding my arm from the few people who remained, real enough to see. I burst through my door, gasping for air, needing to see Sarah, needing to know something was still solid. But the television was already on. It wasn't the news. It was a live feed of our kitchen, my kitchen. But the timestamp in the corner read 5:45 p.m. I looked at my watch. It was only 5:15 p.m. On the screen, Sarah was sitting at the table, her head in her hands, sobbing. She looked older, exhausted. Then, the kitchen door on the screen slowly creaked open. A figure stepped out of the darkness behind her. It was me, but it was the me from the mirror, the one with the void black eyes and the independent hands. On the screen, the reflection Elias leaned down and whispered something into Sarah's ear that made her scream a sound of such pure, unadulterated, soul-shattering terror that I felt my own heart stop. On the screen, my double looked directly into the camera. He smiled, and as he did, he reached out and began to slowly twist Sarah's head toward the lens. The radio on the counter began to howl a countdown. 30 minutes. I had 30 minutes until that broadcast became my reality. I looked at my glowing, static-filled hand and back at the screen. I hadn't saved Clara. I had just traded Sarah's life for hers. And the version of me on the screen, he wasn't just coming for her. He was looking right at me through the glass. 30 minutes. That was the total sum of Elias's remaining life as he knew it. The television screen in his living room hummed with a sickly, ultraviolet glow, displaying a scene that hadn't happened yet. He watched his wife, Sarah, backed into the corner of their kitchen, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to bleed through the pixels. And there, standing over her, was the shadow, a version of Elias that wasn't Elias, a creature of jagged edges and void-like eyes. He looked down at his own right arm. It was worse now. The translucency had climbed past his elbow. His skin didn't look like skin anymore. It looked like a low-resolution image of a cloud, flickering with gray static and white noise. When he moved his fingers, he didn't hear the sound of joints cracking. He heard the faint digital hiss of a radio, tuned to a dead frequency. "Sarah!" he screamed, his voice cracking. He lunged toward the kitchen, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But when he burst through the doorway, the room was empty. The kettle was whistling softly on the stove. The sunlight was filtering peacefully through the blinds. The future he saw on the screen was still 28 minutes away. But the air felt different. It felt heavy, like the atmosphere right before a massive electrical storm. He began to tear the house apart. If the shadow Elias was going to emerge, it had to come from somewhere. He ripped the rugs from the floor, threw aside the furniture, his glitching arm passing through a solid wooden chair as if it were nothing more than a hologram. He felt a sudden sharp chill beneath his feet. In the center of the study, hidden under a heavy mahogany desk that had been there since they moved in, he saw it. A seam in the floorboards. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, Elias shoved the desk aside. His glitching hand fumbled for a recessed iron ring. He pulled. The floor didn't just open, it groaned, a sound of rusted metal and ancient secrets finally being exhaled into the light. Below lay a concrete shaft, cold and smelling of ozone and wet earth. A bunker. He descended the ladder, each rung vibrating under his touch. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of old paper and decaying rubber. At the bottom, he found a heavy steel door with a mechanical wheel. It looked like something out of a Cold War nightmare. He turned the wheel, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the hollows of the house. Inside, the room was filled with humming machinery, vacuum tubes glowing a dull, rhythmic orange, spinning reels of magnetic tape, and chalkboard walls covered in equations that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. This wasn't a storm cellar. It was a laboratory. In the center of the room sat a single wooden desk. On top of it was a manila folder, yellowed with age, its edges brittle. Elias approached it, his translucent hand trembling. The static in his arm was getting louder now, a constant hum in his ears that sounded like 1,000 voices whispering at once. He opened the folder. Inside was a series of black and white photographs. His breath hitched. The first photo showed a man standing in front of this very bunker. The man was wearing a 1950s-era suit, a thin tie, and a fedora. Elias felt the world tilt. It wasn't just someone who looked like him. It was him. The same crooked nose, the same scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the same haunted expression in the eyes. He flipped to the next page. It was a government dossier. The header read, Project Echo, Subject Alpha, Elias Vance. The date at the bottom of the page sent a jolt of pure ice through his veins. December 12th, 1952. That's impossible, he whispered, his voice disappearing into the hum of the vacuum tubes. I was born in 1988. I'm 35 years old. This can't be. He turned the page again. This time, it wasn't a photo. It was a medical chart. It detailed a successful translocation of consciousness and the physical stabilization of a temporal anomaly. And then he saw the final item in the folder, a small silver locket. He recognized it instantly. It was the same locket he had bought for Sarah on their first anniversary. He picked it up, and as he did, the locket flickered. In his hand, it turned into the same gray static as his arm, then solidified again. Suddenly, the television upstairs began to blare. The sound of Sarah's scream echoed down the bunker shaft, raw and terrifying. Elias looked at his watch. 3 minutes left. He turned to run, but his feet caught on a loose floorboard. As he fell, his glitching arm plunged through the concrete wall of the bunker. He didn't feel pain. He felt a connection. For a split second, he saw the entire timeline, his birth, his marriage, and this moment, all stacked on top of each other like a deck of cards. And then, he saw the bottom of the stack. Behind the concrete wall, hidden in a small alcove his arm had passed through, was a glass cylinder. And inside that cylinder, suspended in a glowing blue fluid,
was a body.
They weren't human eyes. They were filled with the same gray static that was currently consuming Elias's arm. The creature in the tank smiled, and as it did, Elias felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest. Upstairs, Sarah's scream cut off abruptly into a sickening silence. He wasn't the one who had been born in 1988. He was the echo, and the original had just woken up. Elias looked at his hand, and it wasn't just static anymore. It was disappearing. He was being deleted. He looked back at the tank, and the creature was gone. The glass was shattered. The blue fluid was spilling onto the floor. He heard footsteps above him, heavy, rhythmic footsteps heading toward the kitchen where Sarah was waiting. "Sarah!" Elias tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was nothing but white noise. He lunged for the ladder, but his legs gave way, turning into a cloud of pixels. He was trapped in 1952, while his nightmare was in the kitchen with his wife in the present. He looked at the folder one last time as his vision began to blur into static. There was one more photo at the very back. It was a photo of Sarah. Not the Sarah he knew. A Sarah from 1952, holding a newborn baby. And the baby had gray, flickering eyes. The paradox was complete. He wasn't the victim of the glitch. He was the result of it. The silence of the bunker was gone, replaced by the deafening sound of my own heartbeat thumping against my ribs. I stood in the doorway of my kitchen, gasping for air that felt too clean, too sweet. It smelled like lemons and fresh-cut grass, but underneath it was the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. I was glitching. My hands would vanish for a split second, turning into a swarm of static, then snap back into solid flesh. It felt like my very atoms were being pulled apart by a magnetic force I couldn't see. I looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand wasn't moving. It was just vibrating, twitching back and forth in a frantic, microscopic dance. Something was wrong. Everything was too bright. The yellow of the walls was too vibrant. The sunlight streaming through the window was too golden. It was a caricature of a home, a postcard version of my life. "Sarah," I called out. My voice sounded hollow, like I was speaking into a deep well. "In here, honey," the voice came from the dining room. It was her. It was exactly her voice, the same pitch, the same gentle lilt, but it felt curated, like a recording played back through high-end speakers. I walked toward the doorway, my legs feeling heavy, like I was wading through molasses. Each step I took caused the floorboards to groan in a way that didn't sound like wood. It sounded like grinding teeth. I saw her standing by the table, setting out plates. She was wearing the blue dress I bought her for her anniversary, the one she'd lost a year ago. She looked perfect, too perfect. Her hair was perfectly coiled, her skin looked like polished porcelain, and she was smiling. She wasn't just smiling at me, she was smiling at the space where a husband should be. "You're just in time for dinner," she said, not looking up. "I made your favorite, beef bourguignon." I felt a cold sweat break across my neck. I hate beef bourguignon. Sarah knows that. I've hated it since I was a kid. "Sarah," I said, my voice trembling, "look at me." She turned. The movement was fluid, almost too graceful. When her eyes met mine, the air left the room. They were her eyes, that deep honey brown I loved, but there was no light behind them, no reflection. It was like looking into two tunnels of dark glass. She didn't blink. She just kept that wide, fixed smile. "Is something wrong, Elias?" she asked. "Where is she?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Where is the real Sarah? The one who knows I can't stand red wine sauce, the one who actually blinks when she speaks?" She tilted her head to the side.
A sickening, wet crack echoed through the room as her neck bent at an impossible angle. I am Sarah. I am the Sarah you deserve. The one who stays. The one who doesn't change.
I backed away, stumbling into the hallway. My body glitched violently then. For a second, I saw the house for what it really was. The walls weren't drywall. They were layers of black, shifting shadows. The furniture was made of calcified bone. The sunlight was a sickly, flickering violet glare. And then, with a snap, it was a beautiful home again. I realized then, I wasn't in my house. I wasn't even in my reality. When that thing, that original Elias, woke up in the bunker, he didn't just escape. He swapped us. He took the real world, the real Sarah, and the real messy, imperfect life, and he dumped me here, in this shadow pocket, a waiting room for anomalies. I looked down at the floor and saw something that shattered the last of my resolve. Lying near the baseboard was Sarah's actual wedding ring, the one with the small scratch on the side from when she dropped it on the driveway. I looked at the woman in the kitchen. She was wearing a ring too, but hers was perfect, flawless. He's with her now, the shadow Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming a dissonant harmony of 3 different tones. He's holding her. He's telling her about his dream, about the man in the bunker who looked just like him. No, I whispered. No, she'll know. She'll see him. She'll know it's not me. The shadow Sarah began to walk toward me. She didn't use her feet. She glided, the floor beneath her feet dissolving into ink with every step. She won't, the thing said, its face beginning to blur, the features melting like wax near a flame. And you have nothing but this ghost of a house. I turned to run for the front door, but as I grabbed the handle, it burned my hand, not with heat, but with cold. A cold so intense, it felt like my skin was being flash frozen. I looked through the peephole. There was no street outside, no neighbors, no trees. There was only a vast, endless void of gray mist, and standing in that mist were hundreds of silhouettes, hundreds of versions of me, all standing still, staring at the house, waiting for their turn to be replaced. A heavy hand landed on my shoulder. It was cold. It was shadow. "Dinner is getting cold, Elias," the voice whispered directly into my ear. I turned around, and the woman's face was gone. In its place was a mirror. And in that mirror, I didn't see myself. I saw the original Elias in my real kitchen, kissing the real Sarah, while he looked directly into the camera of the mirror and winked. I screamed, but no sound came out, only a cloud of black static.
The house began to tilt. The walls began to bleed. And then, the front door, the only exit, simply vanished. I was trapped in the dark with a wife that wasn't a woman, in a world that wasn't a world. And then I heard the lock on the basement door click open. Something else was coming up. The air in the hallway didn't just feel cold, it felt thin, as if the atoms themselves were losing interest in holding the world together. I watched the Sarah standing in the kitchen. Her face didn't just go blank, it pixelated. Her eyes smeared across her cheeks like wet ink on a screen. Then, she was gone. Not a sound, just a soft hiss of ozone and the smell of burning copper. Behind me, the basement door creaked. It wasn't the sound of wood on hinges. It was the sound of a scream being played back at 1,000th of its original speed. Deep. Primal. Wrong. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct I had, every ounce of survivalist training from the bunker, told me to run. But where? The outside world was a hyper-saturated lie. This house was a cage. And the basement? The basement was the source. I turned. The doorway was no longer a rectangle of shadow. It was a pulsing, rhythmic aperture of white noise. I took a step toward it, and the floorboards beneath my feet felt like they were vibrating at a frequency that made my teeth ache. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the frame. It didn't feel like wood. Sphere. "Sarah, look at me," I screamed. She turned her head. Her eyes were voids, filled with the same scrolling text I had seen in the bunker monitors. But deep inside, I saw a spark, a tiny, desperate flicker of the woman I loved. I reached into the amber light. It burned. It felt like 1,000 needles of pure electricity were stitching my skin to the air. I grabbed her hand. It was cold, colder than the bunker, colder than death. Then a voice boomed. It didn't come from the air. It came from inside my own skull. "Did you really think reclamation was an option, Elias?" I froze. Standing on the other side of the sphere was a figure. It wore my clothes. It had my face. But its eyes were mirrors, reflecting a version of me that was already rotting, already deleted. It was the architect, the source of the signal, the thing that had been living my life while I was trapped in the dark. "You are a glitch," it said, its voice a perfect, terrifying harmony of my own. "And glitches are deleted." The floor beneath me dissolved. The amber sphere shattered, and Sarah began to drift away into the white noise, her hand slipping from mine. I reached for her, screaming, but the static was everywhere now. It wasn't just around me, it was in me. My fingers began to turn into pillars of salt and light. The architect leaned over the edge of the void, watching me fall, a look of profound, mechanical pity on its face. "Don't worry, Elias, I'll take good care of her." I fell, not into the basement, not into the dark. I fell into the signal itself. The world exploded into a blinding, deafening roar of pure white. And just before everything vanished, I felt a second hand grab mine. A hand that shouldn't have been there. A hand that felt real. The hand that caught me wasn't warm. It didn't have skin or bone or a pulse. It was made of the very thing I had spent my life running from. White noise. But it was hers. I knew the weight of it. I knew the way the fingers curled, even if they were now composed of flickering pixels and static. Sarah. She wasn't a prisoner here. She was the last thread holding the fabric of reality together. Elias. Her voice echoed, not in my ears, but directly in my marrow. To save the broadcast, you have to stop being the listener. You have to become the signal. I looked up. The architect stood above us, his digital face a kaleidoscope of my own worst memories. He wasn't just a monster. He was the version of me that chose to stay in the dark. He laughed, and the sound was like glass grinding against glass. "You don't understand the cost, Elias," he screamed, his form bloating as he absorbed the surrounding code. "If you reset the clock, you aren't just dying, you are being unwritten. Every photo of you will go blank. Every memory Sarah has of your face will dissolve into static. You won't be a martyr. You will be nothing. Total erasure." I looked at Sarah.
Her eyes were fading, turning into the same dull gray as the sky outside. The real world, was already beginning to tear. People were forgetting how to speak, forgetting the names of their children, as the signal's corruption ate through the collective consciousness of the planet. I felt a strange gold peace wash over me. I reached out and touched the core of the transmitter, a pulsing black sun of raw data. It was burning, not with heat, but with information. Millions of lives, billions of secrets, all waiting to be deleted. "Do it," Sarah whispered. Her form was becoming transparent. "Forget me so they can live." I didn't hesitate. I stepped into the light. The sensation was beyond pain. It was the feeling of a million needles stitching my soul into the frequency. I felt my childhood vanish first, the memory of my mother's perfume, gone. The day I bought my first camera, deleted. My first kiss, static. I was becoming the broadcast. I opened my mouth to scream, but only a dial tone came out. I reached into the architecture of the universe and grabbed the timeline like a fraying rope. With a final agonizing pull, I forced the signal to loop. I saw the world rewinding. I saw the architect scream as he was shredded by the very logic that created him. I saw the basement in the old house rebuild itself. I saw the dust settle. I saw the sun rise over a town that had no idea it had almost ceased to exist. And then I saw Sarah. She was standing in the kitchen of our old apartment. The sunlight was hitting her hair just right. She looked happy. She looked safe. She reached for a photo on the
mantelpiece. A photo of the two of us at the beach. I watched from the static of the television screen, a ghost in the machine. As her fingers touched the glass, my image began to fade. The Elias in the photo dissolved into a blur, then a shadow, then just a background of empty sand and waves. Sarah frowned. She tilted her head, a look of confusion crossing her face. She touched the empty space where I used to be. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply felt a hollow ache she couldn't name. She turned away from the photo, picked up her coffee, and walked out of the room. I was gone. The ultimate price had been paid. The world was reset. The loop was closed. And the signal was silent. Or so I thought. In the corner of the room, the old CRT television, the one I had used to find her, flickered to life. There was no power cord plugged into the wall. The screen stayed black, except for a single tiny pulse of white light in the center. A rhythmic beat, thump-thump, thump-thump, the sound of a digital heart. Then, a voice. My voice. But it wasn't me anymore. It was the new architect,